In the summer of 1483, two young boys vanished from the Tower of London without a trace. They were not ordinary children. They were the rightful heirs to the English throne, sons of a king, brothers bound by blood and tragedy. Their uncle had promised to protect them, to guide them, to ensure their safety until the elder could claim his birthright. But somewhere in those ancient stone walls, in rooms that had witnessed centuries of power and treachery, the princes disappeared. No bodies were ever found. No confession was ever made. No trial ever held. What happened to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. And at the center of it all stands a man whose very name has become synonymous with villainy. Richard III. Did he murder his own nephews to secure his grip on power? Or has history condemned an innocent man for 500 years? The story begins not with Richard, but with his brother. Edward IV was a giant of a man in every sense. Tall, handsome, charismatic, he had seized the English crown through force of arms during the brutal conflict we now call the Wars of the Roses. For over 2 decades, he ruled England with a mixture of charm and ruthlessness that kept his enemies off balance and his kingdom relatively stable. He had married for love rather than politics, choosing Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful widow whose family would come to dominate his court. Together they produced 10 children, and it seemed the Yorkist dynasty was secure. But Edward had a weakness that would prove fatal. He lived too well, ate too much, drank too heavily. In April 1483, still only 40 years old, he fell ill suddenly. Within days, he was dead. His eldest son, also named Edward, was just 12 years old. The boy had been living in Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, preparing for kingship under the guidance of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville. He was by all accounts a promising child, intelligent and well-educated, raised to rule. But he was still a child, and England had bitter experience with child kings. The last one, Henry VI, had presided over decades of chaos and civil war. Edward IV knew the dangers. On his deathbed, he made provisions for his son's minority. He established a regency council, a group of nobles and churchmen who would govern until young Edward came of age. And he named as Lord Protector his own brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. It was a fateful choice, one that would echo through the centuries. Richard was 30 years old in 1483, a seasoned military commander who had served his brother loyally throughout his reign. While Edward had enjoyed the pleasures of court in London, Richard had governed the turbulent north of England with an iron hand, earning a reputation for justice and efficiency. He was not handsome like his brother. Contemporary descriptions suggest he was slight of build, and later accounts, possibly propaganda, claimed he had uneven shoulders. But there is no doubt he was capable, experienced, and utterly devoted to the Yorkist cause. The question that haunts us is this: was he devoted to his nephew, or to his own ambition? When news of Edward's death reached Richard in the north, he moved quickly. He intercepted young Edward on his journey from Ludlow to London, arrested the boy's Woodville uncles and guardians, and took personal charge of his nephew. It was, he claimed, a necessary move to protect the king from the grasping Woodville family, who sought to control the throne through their royal nephew. Richard brought Edward to London and installed him in the Tower. This was not the sinister prison we imagine today. In the 15th century, the Tower of London was a royal residence, the traditional place where monarchs stayed before their coronation. Young Edward was preparing to be crowned king. His coronation was scheduled for late June. But something happened in those crucial weeks that changed everything. On the 13th of June, William Hastings, one of the most powerful nobles in England and a loyal servant of Edward IV, was executed. Richard claimed Hastings had been plotting against him, planning to assassinate the Lord Protector before the coronation. The execution was sudden, brutal, carried out without trial. Hastings was dragged from a council meeting and beheaded on Tower Green within hours. It was a shocking display of power, and it sent a clear message. Richard was in control, and he would not tolerate opposition. Then came the revelation that would tear the kingdom apart. A priest named Robert Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, came forward with an extraordinary claim. He announced that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Before marrying Elizabeth, Edward had allegedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. In the legal and religious understanding of the time, such a pre-contract was as binding as marriage itself. If Stillington was telling the truth, and if Edward had indeed been contracted to Eleanor Butler, then his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous. And if that marriage was invalid, then all their children were illegitimate, including the boy in the tower who was preparing to be crowned king. On the 22nd of June, Richard presented this claim to an assembly of lords and commons. The evidence, such as it was, convinced them. 3 days later, Parliament formally declared Edward IV's children illegitimate and offered the crown to Richard. On the 6th of July 1483, Richard III was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The 12-year-old boy who should have been king remained in the Tower, now joined by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, who had been taken from sanctuary to keep his brother company. The princes were seen less and less frequently, playing in the Tower gardens, appearing at windows. And then, sometime in the late summer or early autumn of 1483, they were seen no more. The disappearance of the princes did not go unnoticed. By the autumn of 1483, rumors were spreading through London and beyond. Whispers in taverns, anxious conversations among merchants, coded messages between nobles. The boys were dead, people said, murdered on the orders of their uncle. But whispers are not evidence, and Richard III remained firmly on his throne, seemingly unbothered by the growing speculation about his nephew's fate. Yet the rumors had power. In October 1483, barely 3 months after Richard's coronation, a major rebellion erupted across southern England. It was led by an unlikely coalition of former supporters of Edward IV and old enemies of the Yorkist dynasty. They united behind a single cause: to overthrow Richard and replace him with Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne who was living in exile in France. The rebellion failed, crushed by Richard's efficient military response. But its very existence revealed something crucial. Richard had lost the trust of many who should have been his natural allies. The disappearance of the princes had poisoned his reign before it truly began. What exactly happened to Edward and Richard of Shrewsbury? The truth is, we do not know with certainty, and perhaps we never will. But over the centuries, historians have pieced together fragments of evidence, testimony, and later discoveries that paint a disturbing picture. The most detailed account comes from Thomas More, the great humanist scholar and future saint, who wrote a history of Richard III in the early 16th century. More was only 7 years old when Richard died, so he could not have been an eyewitness. But he grew up in London in the immediate aftermath of these events and claimed to have gathered information from people who were close to the center of power. According to More's account, Richard ordered the murder of his nephews shortly after his coronation. He sent a trusted servant named John Green to the Constable of the Tower, Sir Robert Brackenbury, with instructions to kill the boys. Brackenbury, to his credit, refused. He would not murder innocent children, even on the king's orders. Richard, frustrated but undeterred, turned to another man, Sir James Tyrrell, a loyal knight who had served the Yorkist cause for years. Tyrrell agreed to do what Brackenbury would not. He went to the Tower with 2 accomplices, Miles Forrest and John Dighton. On a night in late summer, while the princes slept in their chamber, the men entered and smothered them with their pillows. The bodies were buried hastily at the foot of a staircase within the Tower. Tyrrell reported the deed done to Richard, and the matter was closed. More's account is detailed and dramatic, but is it true? We must remember that More was writing during the reign of Henry VIII, the son of Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at Bosworth Field. The Tudor dynasty had every reason to blacken Richard's name, to justify their own seizure of power by portraying him as a monstrous tyrant. More himself never published his history, and some scholars have suggested he intended it not as factual history, but as a moral lesson about tyranny. Yet More did not invent his story from nothing. Many of the people he named were real, and some of the details he provided have been corroborated by other sources. Sir James Tyrrell, for instance, was a real person, and he was indeed close to Richard III. In 1502, during the reign of Henry VII, Tyrrell was arrested for treason on an unrelated matter. Before his execution, according to contemporary accounts, he confessed to murdering the princes on Richard's orders. The confession was never published in full, and we have only fragmentary reports of what he supposedly said, but it broadly matched the story More would later tell. Does this prove Richard's guilt? Not conclusively. Confessions extracted from condemned men are notoriously unreliable. Tyrrell may have been tortured, or he may have been promised leniency for his family in exchange for admitting to a crime he did not commit. Or he may have been telling the truth. Then there is the strange case of the bones. In 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes disappeared, workmen were demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London. About 10 feet below the floor, they discovered a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. The bones were assumed to be those of the murdered princes, and King Charles II ordered them reburied with honor in Westminster Abbey, where they remain to this day in an urn designed by Christopher Wren. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by experts who concluded they belonged to 2 children roughly the ages the princes would have been at the time of their death. But the examination was limited, and modern forensic techniques were not available. Requests to conduct DNA testing on the bones have been denied by the Church of England, leaving us with tantalizing but inconclusive evidence. Yet for all the weight of this circumstantial evidence, there remains the possibility that Richard did not kill his nephews. Some historians have proposed alternative theories. Perhaps the boys died of natural causes, victims of the plague or some other disease that swept through London regularly in the 15th century. Richard, knowing their deaths would be blamed on him regardless, might have concealed the bodies rather than risk the political fallout of announcing their passing. Perhaps they were killed not on Richard's orders, but by overzealous supporters who thought they were acting in his interest. Perhaps they were killed by his enemies, by Henry Tudor's allies seeking to create a propaganda victory, or even by the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's powerful supporter, who later turned against him and might have had his own ambitions for the throne. The most radical theory suggests the boys were not killed at all. A few historians have argued that one or both princes survived and were smuggled out of England, living in obscurity or emerging years later as pretenders to the throne. There were indeed pretenders during Henry VII's reign, young men claiming to be the lost princes, though most historians believe these were impostors exploiting the mystery rather than genuine survivors. What we can say with certainty is this: Richard III had motive, means, and opportunity. He had everything to gain from the princes' deaths and everything to lose if they lived. As long as they drew breath, his claim to the throne was vulnerable. Any noble dissatisfied with his rule could rally behind the legitimate heir. Any foreign power seeking to destabilize England could back young Edward's claim. The boys were a threat to Richard's security, his dynasty, his very life. And Richard was not a man known for sentimentality. He had grown up during the Wars of the Roses, that savage conflict where brothers fought brothers and victors showed no mercy to defeated rivals. He had seen firsthand what happened when you left potential claimants alive. Edward IV had ordered the execution of Henry VI and his son. Why would Richard hesitate to do the same? Yet motive is not proof, and the case against Richard remains frustratingly incomplete. We have accusations, but no definitive confession. We have bones, but no certain identification. We have theories, but no smoking gun. For over 500 years, historians have debated Richard's guilt, and the debate continues today with passion and sophistication that would have astonished the medieval chroniclers who first recorded these events. What makes this mystery so enduring is not just the question of what happened to 2 young boys, but what it reveals about power, ambition, and the stories we tell ourselves about history. Richard III's reign lasted only 2 years. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of exiles and French mercenaries. Richard marched to meet him, and the 2 forces clashed at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. It was a close fight, but at the crucial moment, some of Richard's allies betrayed him or stood aside. Richard, seeing Henry's standard across the battlefield, made a desperate cavalry charge, attempting to end the battle by killing his rival in personal combat. He came close, killing Henry's standard-bearer and cutting down several of his bodyguards, but he was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. His crown, according to legend, was found in a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The Wars of the Roses were over. The Tudor dynasty had begun. Henry VII faced a problem. He had won his throne by conquest, but his claim by blood was weak. He married Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York, but this created an awkward question. If Elizabeth was legitimate, then so were her brothers, and they had a better claim to the throne than Henry. If her brothers were illegitimate, as Richard had claimed, then so was she, and Henry's marriage did nothing to strengthen his position. Henry's solution was elegant and ruthless. He never explicitly declared whether the princes were legitimate or not. Instead, he allowed the story of their murder to spread and encouraged writers and chroniclers to portray Richard as a murderous tyrant who had killed his innocent nephews. This served Henry's purposes perfectly. It blackened Richard's name, justified the Tudor seizure of power as the overthrow of a monster, and conveniently avoided the question of legitimacy altogether. The princes were victims, tragic symbols of Richard's wickedness, and their deaths required no further investigation. This Tudor propaganda was remarkably successful. It shaped how English society remembered Richard III for centuries. Shakespeare's play, written during the reign of Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth I, immortalized Richard as a hunchbacked villain who delighted in evil. "I can call spirits from the vasty deep," Shakespeare's Richard boasts, a man so twisted in body and soul that even his own mother cursed him. Generations of English schoolchildren learned that Richard was a monster, the wicked uncle who murdered the princes in the Tower. It became historical fact, accepted without question. But in recent decades, the Richard III Society and revisionist historians have fought to rehabilitate his reputation. They point out that much of what we think we know about Richard comes from Tudor sources written by his enemies years after his death. They note that during his brief reign, Richard passed progressive legislation, reformed the justice system, and showed concern for the common people. They argue that the physical deformities attributed to him were later inventions designed to match his supposed moral deformity. When Richard's skeleton was discovered beneath a car park in Leicester in 2012, it revealed a man with scoliosis, a curved spine, but nothing like the grotesque hunchback of legend. The discovery sparked renewed interest in Richard and gave his defenders powerful evidence that history had exaggerated and distorted the truth about him. Yet even his most passionate advocates struggle with the central question: what happened to the princes? Some argue that we simply do not know and should not rush to judgment without proof. Others suggest elaborate alternative scenarios. But the uncomfortable truth remains that the boys disappeared while in Richard's custody, that he benefited enormously from their disappearance, and that no credible evidence has ever emerged that they survived. The balance of probability, even if it falls short of absolute certainty, points toward Richard's guilt. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this mystery is not whether Richard killed his nephews, but how easily such a crime could be committed and concealed. In the 15th century, 2 royal children could vanish without a trace, and no one could demand accountability. No investigation could be launched, no justice could be sought. Richard was the king. Who would arrest him? Who would try him? Who would punish him? The boys had no parents to seek vengeance. Their mother Elizabeth Woodville was powerless and in sanctuary. Their sisters were children. Their remaining relatives had either been executed or cowed into submission. There was no free press to investigate, no parliament with real power to demand answers, no concept of human rights or rule of law as we understand them today. Richard could have ordered their deaths with a word, and that word would have been law. This is what makes the story resonate across the centuries. It is not just a historical puzzle to be solved. It is a reminder of how vulnerable the powerless are to the powerful, how easily innocence can be destroyed by ambition, how truth can be buried along with bodies. Those 2 boys, whether they were legitimate kings or bastard princes, were children. They had done nothing wrong. They had committed no crime. Their only fault was being born into a dangerous world where their very existence threatened someone more powerful than themselves. We will probably never know with complete certainty what happened in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. The bones in Westminster Abbey may or may not be those of Edward and Richard. Richard III may have been a murderer or a man unjustly accused by history. The truth, like the princes themselves, has been lost to time. But the questions endure because they matter. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and morality, about how history is written by victors, about how easily evidence can be destroyed and truth can be obscured. What we choose to believe about Richard III says something about us, about whether we trust in systems of power or suspect them, about whether we give people the benefit of doubt or judge them by their actions and their interests. The mystery of the princes in the Tower is ultimately not just about medieval England. It is about human nature, about what people are capable of when they have power and no accountability. 500 years later, we are still trying to answer that question. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. If you found this story as fascinating as I did exploring it, share it with someone who loves history's greatest mysteries. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the moments that changed everything. And drop a comment below. Do you think Richard did it? Or has history condemned an innocent man? The debate has raged for 5 centuries. Maybe you will see something everyone else has missed.